Over in Switzerland, there's a company called Klimaworks that manufactures these machines about the size of a walk-in closet. They're called CO2 capture plants, and each one pulls about 40 tons of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year. That's enough to offset the emissions of 2 average Americans. The pure carbon dioxide could then be pumped into greenhouses where plants bearing fruits, vegetables, and grains breathe it in, turning the carbon into food, plant matter, and soil while exhaling the oxygen. Because the levels of carbon dioxide are so concentrated, the yields in these greenhouses are about 20% higher than normal. Up in Iceland, the company has built a giant array of these things and hooked them up to a geothermal power plant, which uses the Earth's own heat to make electricity. Geothermal plants do emit a small amount of carbon dioxide themselves, but the machines capture enough to offset that, and they infuse it into the porous rocks deep underground, where it stays for centuries. The geothermal plant is, as a result, carbon negative. It generates power while removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than it emits. You can, in theory, take this technology a step further, extracting pure carbon, which you feed into 3D printers that make prefab parts for, say, homes or farm equipment, power them with solar energy, and you could have a carbon-negative factory that literally makes things from thin air while reversing climate change. It's the kind of technology that stirs men's souls and makes you believe we can beat this climate thing. But there's a catch. For now, this exciting new technology costs between $600 and $1,000 per ton of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. Don't get me wrong, it may one day put us over the hump, but when it comes to carbon capture and storage, there's a technology that can get us 37% of the way to meeting the Paris Climate Agreement targets. Sometimes without costing a dime, sometimes at just $10 per ton, and often while increasing food yields and reducing the cost of farming. Yet less than 3% of all carbon finance flows into this exciting technology.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth. We broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields. And not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature itself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today's guest, Bronson Griscom, has explored that impact more deeply than almost anyone I know. He's the director of forest carbon science for the Nature Conservancy. And last year, he headed up a team of 36 researchers from almost 24 institutions tasked with identifying once and for all the realistic potential of using nature as a bulwark against climate change. I caught up to him in November at year-end climate talks in Bonn, Germany. We're focusing on a report called Natural Climate Solutions, which you can probably find with a simple Google search, or you can visit the show notes for today's episode at bionic-planet.com. This will be episode 31. If you've ever been to these climate talks, they're kind of a mess, spread out over several acres with security checkpoints everywhere and meetings happening constantly and in parallel. I've been trying to pin down Griscom since reading his report before the talks began, and we finally caught up to each other at a side event focused on carbon capture and storage, which is where I learned of the technology that I mentioned earlier. We both came out of the event pretty pumped about what we'd just learned, And that's where this interview picks up. I have this vision of these machines all over the world pulling carbon out of the air and infusing it, injecting carbon dioxide into greenhouses so that the plants grow fast and really wonderful, and then pumping other stuff into 3D printers and cranking it out. They're just pulling money out of the air. And you were excited about it too, but you brought up an issue that I thought was kind of interesting, that you're worried about this new, exciting, and kind of next generation technology could take away from some of the things that are here right in front of us right now. Right? Is that kind of what you were?
Yeah. So, Steve, I absolutely share your optimism coming out of that event. Having said that, what I still struggle with is that there is currently a limited pool of financing, of investment in climate solutions. So the land sector is receiving about 2.5% of the financing that's going into climate mitigation, and over 30% of the cost-effective climate mitigation is available from conservation, restoration, and improved practices on the land. Meanwhile, mitigation options are available immediately. There's no technological advancement needed. It's scalable, right? Photosynthesis happens everywhere on the planet. And it's already happening everywhere on the planet. And there are a series of associated benefits that no technology will ever provide, right? Biodiversity conservation, among many other things, soil fertility, water filtration, air filtration. Technologies might be developed that build in some of those co-benefits, but really, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that a technology will build in all of these, certainly not biodiversity. Right. So, bottom line is, I have tremendous optimism, and I think we have to be investing in those technologies, but at the very same time, we also need to figure out how to address an imbalance in the proportion of the existing investment that's going to land-based mitigation.
And let me just mention the name of your report so people can download it. This came out when? This was it's called Natural Climate Solutions, huh? That's a nice
it
simple
just came
name.
out a couple of weeks ago.
These reports, they usually have these big, long, complicated names, and this is...
We did make an effort to keep it simple in some of our terminology, just acknowledging that scientists have a bad history of very dry and unappealing titles.
It's very accessible to it. You looked at all different biomes, and you broke things down by 20 different land-based strategies. Then you looked at not just the mitigation potential, but you also looked at the costs and cost effectiveness. So it's a very practical guide. It's not just crazy out there stuff. And you looked also at a lot of really interesting things about how much of this land can reasonably be. You're not saying let's all go back to green. You said what's available and what isn't.
Yeah. So we put what we called safeguards. We wanted to start the conversation from what's actually at least potentially socially desirable. Mm-hmm. And we know it's not socially desirable to not have food security. Mm-hmm. We know it's not socially desirable to lose fundamental ecosystem diversity. So the good news is that for land-based mitigation options, the vast majority of them are win-win, but the critical issue is that there are some options which can be win-lose, and so essentially we said, look, we're not going to talk about the win-lose, we're only going to talk about the win-win, or win-neutral. Mm-hmm.
And you basically identified 24 gigatons of emission reductions.
That's right.
Per year, right? Or was that over the course?
Yeah, and let me just qualify that, though. So it's 24 billion tons CO2 per year of mitigation potential, and that includes both avoided emissions and additional sequestration. Okay, so both sinks and avoided sources. A simple comparison would be avoided deforestation would be an avoided emission, reforestation would be an enhanced sink.
Right.
In the ag sector, you have a number of better practices, such as cover crops, during the off season, better grazing practices that will increase the sink into the soils and actually creates more fertile soil, so there's a win-win there. But there are other ag practices that are an avoided emission. So avoiding the excessive use of fertilizers is actually amazing, the extent to which fertilizers are essentially over-applied just because farmers don't have a sophisticated methods, even though they're available, they're not being used in many places to target the application of fertilizers to actually optimize the growth of the plants, but not burn them.
Right.
And so there's an example where you're actually saving money by optimizing the application of fertilizers and avoiding an emission. So bottom line is there's both avoided emissions and additional sinks in both the forestry and the ag sectors, as well as in the wetland sector, which we bring into the equation.
Did you look at agroforestry as well as a?
We did.
Because that's a field that I've just discovered it.
Yeah.
It didn't exist until I found it 2 years ago, but it's just fascinating to see what
Yeah.
when you visit these farms in Kenya and places, and you see what the places that are using kind of old school farming, and then you go right next door and they're doing agroforestry, and you see trees, and you've got corn, it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
What keeps kind of coming back to me on agroforestry is I just keep thinking it could be a lifestyle choice in places like the U.S. even though it's not, from a mega production standpoint, it's not the way to go.
Yeah.
But in Kenya, one thing I've found is people who have grown up in the city and they're becoming fairly successful, they go and they buy a farm. Their parents moved into the city. There's this whole back to the land movement in Kenya, and it's people buying small farms and treating them as a hobby that makes money. Did you look at this at all?
Yeah, no, we did. Having said that, it being a global analysis, we didn't get nearly as granular as the kind of story you're telling.
Right.
But let me just emphasize that's the kind of story that we're excited about, and that is embedded in actually at least two of the pathways. So the two main pathways. So again, just to clarify that we use the term pathway to refer to a category of action, a type of action that we can take to either avoid emissions or increase sinks in terrestrial ecosystems. Two of those pathways are where agroforestry plays in. One of them is called trees in croplands, and the other one is reforestation. Because agroforestry is actually it involves a tremendous range of options, from adding one tree across a hectare or an acre to provide forage for your cattle at one extreme, to an actual forest that's a full, it's completely tree dominated. On one extreme, agroforestry can be really dominated by annual crops and more of an sort of, a cropland system, but with trees. And the other extreme is a cultivated forest system. So that's why we had sort of divided those up. But the bottom line is that one of the things that's so exciting, and this is counterintuitive, right? But is so exciting to me is in the process of running this analysis is realizing all of the places in which land use is wrong or problematic, which points to all the opportunities we have to do a better job. So the notion that there's sort of these fundamental conflicts between feeding a growing human population and storing carbon on the land, I think a lot of people have fears about that, and we should, because we got to make sure that we avoid those kind of conflicts between actually feeding people and restoring landscapes. But there's a shocking extent to which there are not trade-offs. and so one example in agroforestry is that temperate agricultural systems have been exported to the tropics. And part of that history of exporting grains and annual sort of crops to the tropics has been using production systems in the tropics that aren't actually the most effective production systems, given the type of soil and given the type of climate in those systems. So what that means is that in a lot of tropical systems, you can produce more and in a more resilient way, less susceptible to fluctuations in climate, by shifting from annuals to tree-based crops. Because in the tropics, there are a lot of different trees that produce food.
You're talking about, like in the Amazon, you go through what used to be the Amazon forest, and now they've cleared these trees away, and you've got corn, or you got soybeans growing there. That's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And in fact, we've, back in the day, right, sort of during the colonial era, there's the notion of like, oh, there's all this wild forest that we're clearing to put in crops. Turns out a lot of those forests were actually cultivated forests, by people.
Yeah.
We're doing a hyper-simplified version of kind of history here, but the bottom line is that there are tremendous opportunities to produce food from agroforestry systems that store a lot more carbon, and these opportunities are particularly dramatic in the tropics.
Yeah. The Amazon is a cultivated forest for thousands of years. the indigenous people were selectively extracting trees that weren't. They were getting rid of the trees that didn't yield fruit, and they were letting the ones that grow fruit. This is what you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was another one of these epiphanies that was new to me a couple of years ago, and I find that so interesting.
Yeah.
I experienced that epiphany while listening to an audiobook called 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles C. Mann, which you can buy at audible.com. If you're new to Audible, you can get it for free and help support Bionic Planet by signing up for a 30-day trial at audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. That's Bionic Planet as a single word with no dots, dashes, or spaces. The address again, audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. Or if you really like the show and think this is important material that others should hear as well, you can share Bionic Planet with friends, and you can give me a solid 5-star review on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, or wherever you access me. That helps us all because the more stars I get, the more ears I get. The more ears I get, the more brains I reach. Finally, you can also become a member for as little as $1 per month at bionic-planet.com or Patreon, that's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Once again, that's bionic-planet.com or patreon.com/Bionic Planet. As you may have noticed, I'm shifting my support from the old system to Patreon. If you want to migrate over, feel free to do so, but it's not necessary. I've set the patronage page up so that you can support me per episode, but with a monthly cap. So if you think $5 per month is good for a 5-episode month, you can pledge $1 per episode, but with a $5 monthly cap. That way, if I don't manage to generate 5 episodes in a month, you're not paying for something you didn't get. And if I go nuts and deliver 20 episodes per month, you won't get whacked either. You identified about 30% more potential mitigation than previous studies. Why is yours so much higher than what other people found? What did you look at that they didn't see?
Frankly, it was initially a bit of a head scratcher because we were not expecting to get a higher overall number than other studies. And so we actually had to go back and look and try to answer that question for ourselves. And what we realized is that there are a number of pathways that were not fully included in any other prior assessment. There are a variety of prior assessments that have been done, some of which focus on particular regions of the world, such as the tropics, excluding temperate and boreal zones. There are other studies that include some pathways globally, but not others. But there are no pathways that fully include, at least to the extent that we have, all 3 biomes that we looked at. So wetlands, agricultural, and grassland systems, and forests. And did so globally. And in particular, so just for some examples, wetland systems had been relatively ignored. They were not fully included in the last IPCC report. Some aspects of wetlands were, but many aspects were not. So when I say wetlands, by the way, I'm talking about a whole range of ecosystems from mangroves to what are called peat swamps, which is freshwater wetlands, other types of coastal wetlands like salt marshes, seagrass beds. Another category are, just as an example, is things like savanna burning, so early season savanna burning that better mimics natural fire regimes, can increase carbon storage in sort of transitional grassland savanna ecosystems. So that's another example of something that we think has not been picked up before and included. So bottom line is we filled gaps, and we think that's the reason why our number is higher than prior studies.
And forests are where the most potential is, and then wetlands were number 2, right? Wasn't that the...
Actually, I think it's agriculture. Sorry, yeah, agriculture is the number 2.
Okay.
And wetlands were number 3.
Did you factor in the other greenhouse gases as well? Or
we did.
Okay, because I saw you alluded to that here, but I wasn't sure if that was actually in the final...
Yep. We did. We included, all greenhouse gas emissions that were significant enough to warrant including. And I will say this, is that the proportion of non-CO2 greenhouse gases that are at play in the land sector is lower than the overall proportion for all anthropogenic emissions, which is just to say that CO2 emissions tend to particularly dominate in the land sector. Having said that, there are very important exceptions to that in terms of methane emissions in wetland systems.
From standing water. Right?
That's right. I mean, yeah, exactly. Methane plays an important role in kind of in wetland systems, as well as in livestock, cattle systems. Nitrogen is a critical factor in better fertilizer management. So there are a variety of exceptions, but CO2 dominates.
You looked at this globally and you said, okay, this is what we could do if cost were not an issue.
Yep.
And then you said, okay, now let's kind of go the next step. Let's look at this realistically and say, this put in the costs. And what would be, like when you start looking at the most cost-effective solutions that we could implement, is there one that you would want to maybe run through and highlight?
Yeah, so we highlight a few of the most cost-effective. So we essentially did 2 price points. One is set at a price that would be saving money based upon the expected cost of climate change. Mm-hmm. So climate change is expected to cost more than $100 per ton of CO2 in the air to society. So if we were totally rational creatures, we would say, okay, then I should pay at least $100 to avoid a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Right.
So we used that as one price point to say, okay, essentially what is the rational investment level in each of these pathways? And then we said, okay, that's $100 per ton. Society right now is not yet willing to pay that amount. On the other end, there's the amount that we are investing in climate mitigation in certain parts of the world. California is the best example in the U.S., where they're already paying, I think it's like $12 per ton of CO2. So then we also looked at that level to say, hey, where's the low-hanging fruit? Where's the stuff that's kind of like, we should be doing this right now based upon existing financing mechanisms. Some examples. So avoided forest conversion is is the second largest pathway that we discovered, but it is the largest pathway in terms of the lowest cost $10 per ton opportunity.
The $10 per ton is based on the price of, like, say, a voluntary offset?
You can have different types of mechanisms for valuing carbon. So it could be a carbon tax. It could be, where the revenues for that tax are then invested in types of solutions. It could be a cap and trade system like in California. But in any case, the notion is if you were willing to pay for $10 per ton of CO2 that is not in the atmosphere and stored instead in living ecosystems, what would be the rational amount of investment in any one of these pathways? And the largest option for that level of willingness to pay is avoided forest conversion.
Why not reforestation?
Because when you convert a forest to a non-forest, you are, in the period of a year or two, taking 100+ years of carbon storage from the growth of that forest and putting it into the atmosphere all at once. So there's a pulse of emissions.
Right.
Whereas when you reforest, you have to wait. Every year it grows a little bit. It grows a little bit. So it just means that the annual phenomenon is much more dramatic when you convert a standing forest.
Right. Yeah, I see how you use you're looking at between now and 2030 explicitly here.
Yeah.
Right.
So for every acre or hectare of land that you don't clear, you avoid a much bigger emission than the sequestration of every hectare that you begin to reforest.
Gotcha.
And plant new seeds. Having said that, there's a lot more land that you can reforest than there is land that's deforested every year. So the flip side to that is that the actual total potential for reforestation is higher than avoided deforestation. But in what's called, I think at Harvard it's called the mitigation hierarchy. Mm-hmm. The notion is, start by, not damaging the system as kind of a first priority, and then, restore that system. Mm-hmm. So stop, take your boot off the neck of Mother Nature first, and then, help her stand up and restore her to better health. Having said that, we no longer have the luxury of taking this in a sort of one thing at a time sequence. Mm-hmm. We've got to be doing these things all at once.
Right.
And, we have, one of the things that just hit me hard as I just scratched the edge of working with co-authors on this study to run the projection of essentially the climate projections out into the future that we did, is the urgency of ramping up our climate mitigation across the board with all options as soon as possible. What's shocking is the extent to which, if we delay action for a decade, it's virtually impossible to see how we're going to actually get to limiting warming below 2 degrees.
So, how urgent is it? Urgent enough to scare the hell out of every scientific organization on the planet that deals with climate, from the National Academy of Sciences in the United States to the UK Met Office to, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. Pretty much any scientific body that isn't funded by the Koch brothers, the Mercer family, and a handful of other kleptocrats agrees that we are at a critical juncture. And if you don't believe me, you can download an audiobook called Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean, or the now classic Dark Money by Jane Meyer, or Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes. All are available at Amazon.com or in audiobook format at Audible.com. If you're a first-time user of either service, you can help me build a counter-propaganda war chest to improve Bionic Planet and bring you more and better episodes. If it's Audible you want, then sign up for a free 30-day trial at audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. That's Bionic Planet as a single word with no dots, dashes, or spaces. The address again, audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. If it's books you want, just go to bionic-planet.com and click on the Amazon advertisement. That will take you to the Amazon site, and I'll get a few pennies for sending you there. You can also share Bionic Planet with friends, and you can give me a solid 5-star review on iTunes, TuneIn, or wherever you access me. Finally, you can also become a patron for as little as $1 per month at bionic-planet.com or at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Once again, that's bionic-planet.com or patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Getting back to my interview with Bronson Griscom, we had a hard copy of his report in front of us, and you can find a link to that report in the show notes for episode 31 at bionic-planet.com or by doing a Google search for Natural Climate Solutions. And let me just and describe this chart you've got, because this is something I would encourage anybody who's listening to go and check it out, because it's pretty accessible. It's very easy to see what you're describing. You've got the 20 different activities, and then each is broken into a bar. The left side of the bar is gray, and that's the low-cost portion. That's kind of the dark gray. Then you've got the kind of medium gray, which is a little higher cost, and then the white one is the just the most you can go, I guess, right? Would that be the way?
Right. Yeah. Most can you go without passing essentially the guardrails we put on that, the safeguards.
Gotcha. Okay, that's okay. Now, so go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Absolutely. So, so two or three other really low cost, particularly exciting options that emerged. So one of them is natural forest management. Mm-hmm. So what we mean by this is primarily natural forests that are managed for timber production. Mm-hmm. Something like half of all forests in the world are managed for some degree of timber production. And about 7% of forests are in intensive plantations, but the vast majority of the extent of what we're calling working forests, production forests, are essentially natural forests that are harvested. So in those really extensive natural forests that are harvested, the practices used to harvest trees in natural forests tend to be pretty sloppy. And what that means is that there's a lot of damage done to the forest while extracting those trees that actually have commercial value, because not all the trees in the forest will have commercial value, especially in more diverse forests. What I love about this one is that you can professionalize that business model of extracting trees from a natural forest while maintaining the the wood production and increasing the carbon stocks because you're essentially being more efficient. We're talking about improving a business model to harvest wood while improving the integrity and the storage of forests. It's a huge opportunity across vast areas of tropical forests and temperate forests.
I just did a piece on a group called the Dogwood Alliance. I don't know if you know them.
I've heard of them, yes.
And they did a lot of work with Staples, where Staples was paying, because Staples wanted to increase its supply of certified as sustainable paper. And so they bought carbon offsets from all these small landowners to see if it would be cost effective to use carbon finance to get these landowners to shift to FSC certified practices. And what they basically found is it only worked if you had a large piece of land. If it was a smaller one, it just wasn't financially viable. But they did have a video that was really, really clear to see what they did, because they just went with one of the companies was a group called the Forestland Group.
Okay.
And they're a big landowner. And they were just kind of walking through the forest saying, okay, you see this here? Now this is kind of dead wood. This tree is unproductive. If we were just doing this the normal way, we would have removed this because it's in the way. But now because we're getting the carbon payments for this, it's actually viable for us to leave these trees standing and go in and more selectively log. That's what you're talking about, I guess, right?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Let me give you one more example. So we've got a project in Southern Virginia called it's in the Clinch Valley, the Clinch River Valley, and the initial goal of this conservation work that we, the Nature Conservancy, were doing there is we were concerned about an endangered freshwater mussel that was suffering from the lack of water quality, soil erosion that was dumping soil into streams that was going into the river and killing off this species of freshwater mussel. This is mostly private lands. So what we did is we went and we connected with a number of landowners in this pretty remote part of Southern Virginia. And we said, hey, we'll make a deal with you. If you sell us an easement, you agree to not develop your land, then we will pay you, the landowner, an annual fee for harvesting the timber. And we're going to pay you the amount that you've been making historically off of just, the primary use of this land, which is earning a few bucks from harvesting wood. So we say, okay, we're going to pay you an annual fee, and then we, the Nature Conservancy, are actually going to do the timber harvest for you. We're going to manage that. And then what we do is we bring in really good foresters to do top-of-the-line, low-impact logging, maintains the jobs in that region where you really desperately need jobs, maintains wood production, which actually we've got to maintain because the alternatives to wood, cement and steel, have higher carbon footprint. Right. So maintains that, but dramatically reduces the sediment loads, is maintaining that endangered mussel. And then along the way we realized, my gosh, we could sell carbon credits because we're storing more carbon. So it wasn't even in the initial reason we did it, but we realized that is now the primary financing for that, and it's allowing us to expand that model far beyond the Clinch Valley.
Interesting. Getting back to the chart, you'd mentioned nutrient management before, which is fertilizer, I guess. And I see here on this chart that's one of the best low-cost solutions in the agriculture and grasslands section. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
In simple terms, it's more targeted use of fertilizers, which translates to reduced fertilizer application, but actually applying the fertilizer at the level that is optimal for the crop to grow. A triple win outcome. And let me give you an example of how we're actually doing this in the U.S. We have something called the Soil Health Initiative, and one of the things that we're doing as part of that is working with farmers to improve practices and the technology that's used to apply fertilizers. The machinery used to apply fertilizer has high-quality GPS units that record exactly how much fertilizers are being placed in every square meter of land. And then you can monitor yield, the production, the following season and see actually how much they produce. Right, okay. And then you also can test the soil in many locations and determine kind of what is the actual micro need across the field and really get targeted about your application. So in that example, there's an initial capital investment in a technology, but it saves money over the long term. It improves yields because when plants get too much fertilizer, they get burned. And then here's the kicker. It's helping us deal with the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? because the result of all this overapplication of nutrients throughout the heartland of the U.S. is draining down into the Gulf of Mexico, creating a massive dead zone that is terrible for fisheries, terrible for diversity in the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got a really important contribution to avoided nitrous oxide emissions, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. You've got improved crop yields. You've got better soil health, long-term soil health, and you've got better health of the streams and the river and the Gulf of Mexico, all for a strategy that over the long haul is saving money for farmers. A lot of the big wins there are in developing countries, and they don't always require a big technology play. It can be actually just some basic practices that are used.
I'm cognizant of the time. I could go on forever, but is there any particular pathway that you wanted to highlight before we wrap up?
One more to highlight is what we're calling avoided peat impacts. So these are freshwater wetlands, forested wetlands in Indonesia. They can have tens of meters, so like 30 plus feet of peat soil, okay, this dark organic soil that just built up over centuries on those sites. And so what you have is the highest density of carbon storage of any ecosystem. You can have pretty good agricultural production on those types of soils, but what you need to do in order to transform those peat wetlands into agriculture is dig ditches that drain the water out. And then what happens is, as you drain the water out, then all of a sudden that rich organic soil starts to decompose and it's just emitted into the atmosphere. So what you get is a massive pulse of CO2 into the atmosphere for every acre. Now, here's a case where there is a trade-off here, right? We're talking about the need to halt that conversion of a system into an agricultural productive system. However, the trade-off there is so dramatic that's kind of where we need to put our foot down and say, okay, look, that's a place where agriculture simply should not go. Yeah. Not to mention the fact that sometimes some of the big attempts to open up those systems have been complete failures. So they've gone in and ditched and drained vast areas and then discovered that, oh gosh, it actually is not very productive after all. They had this big rice project. Right. And so it's like lose-lose. Spent a bunch of money, emitted vast amounts of carbon, and nobody benefits.
Okay, and one last question. Over in the negotiations, they agreed to fast-track policies around agriculture, mostly because so many countries have pledged to reduce their emissions by improving their agriculture practices, but then they realized they couldn't put a number on those practices. Do you see this research feeding into that? I guess I would assume that's your goal, right?
Absolutely. And so I think exactly kind of what we are already seeing as a next step, but we hope there's a growing awareness of, is that, look, folks, we now have a whole set of different specific actions that we can take to increase storage of carbon in soils, essentially removing this carbon pollution from the air and turning it into healthier, fertile soils. And here's a menu of options. Some of them are more relevant in some countries than in others. And let's dig in on, the actual specific practices, the specific technologies that are going to be relevant in country X for, this pathway. So getting down to that granular level of conversation about how to actually implement this stuff, that's where we have to get to, because we don't want to stay in the stratosphere of just being inspirational. We've got to get down to action today.
Bronson Griscom of the Nature Conservancy closing out this episode of Bionic Planet. If you like what you hear, be sure to share the love by giving me a good rating on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access the show. You can also support me financially for as little as $1 per month by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com. If enough of you do that, I can deliver more episodes and maybe better produced episodes to boot, with a second set of ears and better editing and pacing. And finally, if you listen to audiobooks, you can support by visiting audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet for a free 30-day trial at audible.com. The address again is audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. That's Bionic Planet with no dots, dashes, or spaces, as opposed to my website, which is bionic-planet.com. That's all for today. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.